Normal in the 60s was that a woman needed her husband's permission to get birth control, needed her husband's signature to get a loan. Normal was women didn't go to Ivy League schools. That was normal. Is that the normal you're talking about?
This is the Rebel HR Podcast. If you're a professional looking for innovative, thought-provoking information in the world of human resources, this is the right podcast for you. Rebel on, HR Rebels. All right, Rebel HR listeners, I'm extremely excited to welcome our guest today, Ira Wolfe. Ira is a millennial trapped in a baby boomer body and the world's first Chief Googlization Officer. He ranks in the top 5 global thought leaders in future of work and HR on Thinkers 360. He's the president of Poised for the Future company and founder of Success Performance Solutions. He's presented at a number of different stages, and today we're going to be talking about Googlization of HR. Welcome to the show, Ira.
Hey, thanks very much, Kyle. Hope you're doing well. I really appreciate being here.
Well, we appreciate you spending some time with us, and I'm fascinated to dig into this topic. You know, we're all about kind of innovation in the HR space, and I think some of the work that you do and your perspective is going to be really, really valuable. So why don't we start off, just for our listeners, what is Googlization?
Glad you asked that. Googlization literally started about 13, 14 years ago. My prior book was Geezer's Googlization, which is now I use that as the name of my podcast. But it was going to be about the wired, tired, and technology. We were talking about the four or five generations in the workplace at the time, and people were just talking about. At that point, it was the millennials, and then a couple of years prior to that, it was Gen X, and then and now we talk about Gen Z. But ultimately, people tended to just look at the generations and exclude the environment that they grew up in, the technology. So I wrote the book on saying, okay, yeah, there are differences in the 4 generations or 5 generations, but there is an impact of technology. So I was going to call it the wired, tired, and technology. And then I heard Warren Bennis had a book out about the geeks and the geezers, and I thought that was a good aspect. And there was geeks, geezers, and technology. And I don't know where I saw it, but I came up somewhere with Googlization. I think I saw the ization of something. And it's like Googlization. And the alliteration worked great. A lot of my themes are about people remember alliterations.
Sure.
So sort of like acronyms and mnemonics. What it evolved to when I was going to do an update to the book, realizing I actually didn't talk a whole lot about technology in the book. A couple of years later, it was about 2015, 2016, I did my TED Talk. It was about change. And I said, okay, I have all this information. I'm going to kind of expand upon, my 15-minute TED Talk. I'm going to write a book. And so I went back to Geeks, Geezers, Googlization, figured didn't talk about Gen Z at the time because they really were not in the workplace. And I realized that the technology, we were talking about this before we just went on the air. The technology changed so fast. So here I wrote a book in 2008. The iPhone had just come out in 2007. And it's like, how did I not talk about like the iPad, about tablets, not about the iPad itself, but I didn't talk about tablets or the cloud. And realizing the iPad wasn't introduced to 2010. And then between 2010 and 2016, it became well adapted. It became mainstream.
Ubiquitous. Yeah.
Yeah. And there were so many different tablets, and then their phones got smaller, then they got larger, so they became almost mini tablets.
Right.
So the theme became how quickly things changed, and Googlization actually a long way around there, but Googlization became the convergence of people, technology, and business.
Interesting.
And then we had 2020, and it was really the convergence of people, technology, and business.
Yeah, your timing's right. Your timing is right. 2020, and if you weren't at least a little bit tech savvy. You had to figure it out pretty quick last year. That's for sure.
Oh, absolutely. And people are struggling, and that's something, we can go into. My passion project for about the last year and a half, which just, again, happened to find a lot of time last year to be able to do it, was about adaptability, about, what's required for people to change. And we talked about that, but most people thought it was a functional thing, that if you knew how to use technology, or if you learned how to use technology, that meant you were adaptable. No, it just meant you knew how to use technology. But people are
Mm-hmm.
struggling with it. I mean, people are struggling. People were sent home, and now they're back. They're trying to get back. People are struggling. What does back mean? What does
Right.
back to normal mean? Uh, what does that? People are talking. You're in HR, and what's the hybrid workforce look like? And people think it's this. You're either at home, you're at work, or you're hybrid. Okay, now you get into hybrid, and no one has a clue what hybrid means. Is hybrid means 4 days a week in the office and 1 day out? Because that's not what a lot of people think is hybrid. It's like, well, I'll come in when I have to, but that doesn't mean I'm coming in 4 days a week. Is it 3 days a week? Is it 2 days a week? And then do all the people who are talking about that they say, yeah, I really want to get back to the office, but I'm also don't want to commute 5 days a week. So I'm
Right.
going to come in Mondays and Wednesdays because my spouse is coming in. Those are the days I'll be home with the kids,
Yeah.
and I can be at home. And they say, but we want you to come in Tuesday and Thursday. Well, that doesn't work
Right. Right.
anymore, because people adapted to this, and I don't. People just aren't going back to it. I mean, I've seen statistics as high as 80% of people who were working remote want to continue to work remote some of the time.
Yeah.
And some of the time becomes the variable. So, from an HR perspective, from a management perspective, how do we make it work all the time? And then the rabbit hole goes down. So, how do you develop a culture when there's
Right.
one group of workers coming in Monday and Wednesday, and another one coming in Tuesday and Thursday, and every once in a while, everybody gets together. And how do you make that happen? And how do you create a culture during that environment? That's
Yeah.
Googlization, by the way. That's the
Yeah.
long explanation of Googlization. That's what it is. It's not just Google. It's really beyond Google, but it's about the convergence of people, technology, and business.
Right. And I think, that kind of that thought exercise that you just went through, and that thinking, I mean, that's happening everywhere right now. If and you're the person in the HR department trying to figure out okay, you've got all these things converging at once. You've got all this implementation of this new technology that probably has worked better than you expected in most cases. I think I was actually pleasantly surprised how quickly people adapted to video meetings instead of business travel meetings, and the efficiency that came out of that. But yeah, then you also have the counter argument of, how do you build a culture when you haven't intentionally structured your business around working remotely? And the answer is it's really, really freaking hard.
Well, it was
It's
hard before,
yeah,
and I
exactly.
think it became, oh, we were. It's almost, and I say this not so much tongue in cheek because it's a little bit sarcastic here. Sarcasm is that we talked about how do we build a culture remote, but then you go back to Gallup. Certainly, everybody's probably familiar with the Gallup statistics that we only had 30% engagement of employees before the pandemic
Right,
for years.
right.
And it's not like, oh, well, it was really tough in 2019. No, this is going back since they started. It's almost 25 years, I think, they've been tracking employee engagement. And statistically, it's pretty consistent. It was about 30% of the workforce was engaged, and 70% was disengaged. So the even though we focused and we talked a lot about company culture, we weren't very good at it for all those
We've
years.
always sucked.
Yeah, it wasn't very good.
Yeah.
And so here's a kind of a clean slate. And yeah, for some people, it was very, very difficult. How do we through a two-dimensional screen create a culture, and yet other companies did it. In fact, some companies it improved because there was more engagement, there was more availability. The senior manager, the CEO, and the other senior managers became more authentic. They
Right.
became more transparent. You were able to see inside their home. They were interrupted by kids. They were interrupted by cats and dogs. The phone rang. Oh, hang on, the doorbell is ringing. My Amazon delivery's here. I got to go sign for it. Where if that happened, and that's all culture, by the way.
Right.
There's no magic to it. That's culture. If that happened before the pandemic, then it's, hey, when we have a meeting, you need to be focused. And then all of a sudden, everybody became vulnerable. Everybody became susceptible. So in some ways, the culture was exposed, and it's like we weren't very good at this before, and now we have a chance of making it better. And you can do it through technology exclusively. Is Slack as good as having a chat around the water cooler? No. But if I don't have to spend an hour and a half in commuting each
Right.
way and all the hassles, and I can do it instantaneously, yeah, I think it's probably a better culture. So
Yeah.
I really push back on the fact of how hard it is. I just don't think we were very good at it in the first place, but we were pushed to do it because
Right.
now it's all of a sudden, well, how do we have a culture in a remote workforce? And you
Right.
go, I don't know, because we don't have a good we didn't have a good blueprint before this.
Well, it's that's an interesting point. One of the things that I would call out, and I'm sure many other HR practitioners can relate to this. We also there's a lot more visibility on it now because we can much more efficiently gauge how our teams are feeling through the use of some of these tools. So now that everybody's on a video call, I can see everybody's nonverbals on that call, and oh man, I know something's going on. Something's going on with Gary. Gary looks really pissed off. I better see. It's like we have all these data points now, and it's some of the things that may have been happening, on a phone call that we just don't know about are now on a
Right.
video call that we do, and I think it's highlighted some of those challenges for me specifically, my job prior to the pandemic was traveling 50% of the time. And as an HR guy, I'm traveling around to see how the team's doing, and do audits and assessments and help. And a lot of my job does need to be in person, but the efficiency of being able to talk to somebody in Singapore or Amsterdam or the UK in a matter of minutes is so much more effective than getting jet lagged and being gone from my family for a week, right? So there is definitely some things that need to be retained. My experience, I would agree that our experience at my company has specifically been it's been an improved employee experience, and we've seen significantly improved connections, especially amongst our global business units that have you know, previously pretty much were in silos and didn't interact with each other much.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're seeing a lot of that interaction, and I think technology has enabled it. I guess my question would be, as I reflect on that, what if 2020 hadn't happened? What if it wasn't that weird like black swan event and everybody just gets forced to do this? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, it's interesting because we talk about. I don't talk about the black swan, but Nassim Taleb was who came up with that term, the black swan. He wrote the book on it, and frankly, the pandemic was not a black swan event because it was predictable. So,
Yeah, fair point.
we just ignored all the signs,
Yeah, we just didn't listen.
or many people did. But he talks about being anti-fragile of how do you grow, which is what we're talking about. How do you grow stronger? It's not just resilience. Resilience is how do you bounce back, and grit, and there's a lot of people talk about grit, and they talk about, that's endurance, that's perseverance and passion, according to Angela Duckworth. But if the environment's changing around there and you're just persevering and you're bouncing back, but everything else is changing around you, then you came back to, it's like Rip Van Winkle, or what was it, Shawshank Redemption, It comes out 50 years later and it's like, wow, the world's moving so fast. It changed so much. And that's sort of what happens with grit and resilience is that's where you come out. And what Nassim Taleb, well, a long way around Black Swan, but what Nassim Taleb talks about uh, is how do you grow, how do you become anti-fragile? Anti-fragile is how do you grow stronger? How do you become better after an event like this? And a lot of people are just in coping mode
Hmm.
and doing that. And I think, and that relates back to the culture, that relates back to the technology, is that, hey, this is the new world. We're not going back to the way it was. We're not going back to a normal that we used to know. And we can talk about, some of that as well. But one of the things that we are going to do is that we need to, what lessons did we learn through the pandemic? And certainly one of them is we don't have to have every meeting in person. There will be occasions where the interaction, until we have virtual reality and holograms, mainstream. Until then, there will be opportunity that and situations where physically we should be in the same place,
Right.
but we don't need to be for quite a bit. And people who have telecommuted for years, I've been virtual for 15 years, actually more than that, since 2004, because we moved an office and I never moved into the office because I had an interim. I was also on an interim role as a VP of a hospital. So I said, oh, I was supposed to be for 6 months. When we're out of that, I'll move into my office. And that extended for 3 years, the end of 3 years. And I said, I'm not going to move back in because everybody's used to me not being there. So I'm not going to move back into my office. And I literally moved out of state. And then my employee, who's one of my employees, has been with me for 18 years, said, do you mind if I move to, is it okay if I work from Virginia? And I said, well, sure, I'm working from Maryland, the office. And so we shut down the office. She moved to Virginia. Now she's in Missouri. We've been doing it all along and it functioned fine. So the world caught up to us last year and realized it can work. Yeah, there's times where it would be nice to just walk into the other office and drop something on the desk. But you don't have to. And I think that's the lesson we were. So you asked about what happened in, well, there's two sides. I asked the other way around. I said, what if 2020 wasn't the blip?
Right.
Which is what a lot of people think. Oh, that's like a once in 100 years. So now we can go to the next 99 years and everything's going to be normal. No, that's not the case. This is the normal. What if 2020 didn't happen? It would have probably stayed on the projections that existed, that by 2030 you'd have 40% of the population working remote. We did it in 48 hours in 2020.
Kicking and screaming, but you
Yeah.
got it done. It was
Well, you
ugly.
didn't have time to kick and scream. You just did it. It's like just go home. Actually, my stepdaughter and daughter-in-law, she was just called into work. They decided after a year they're shutting down the office. And it's like, hey, come in and pick up your computer. Up until then they were working on a laptop, and it's like,
Yeah.
no, come in and pick up your computer. So there's still those transitions going along. It's going to be somewhere in the hybrid world, but I think if people are looking for hybrid as some type of defined workspace, we had some guests on my podcast and talking about it. They talk about the 4-day work week, um, which has been talked about for years. And a 4-day work week is not it, it really is a symbol for change. It's not necessarily 4 10-hour days, which people say, oh, yeah, we can do that. And then you can have off Friday. Now it goes beyond that. It may be a 4-day work week also can mean 2 days in the office, 2 days remote.
Right.
4-day work week, we're redefined work. Work does not mean it has to be done in an office.
Right.
And by the way, remote doesn't mean it has to be done at home. You were working remote when you were
Yeah.
when you weren't in the office, you were working remote.
Right. Right.
So remote is even a misnomer. People always think is it because you were. I talked to somebody the other day. Said 90% of her time she spent traveling. She had an office, but she's been remote, but nobody ever considered her remote because she had a name tag on an office in
Right.
a corporate building, which was never used.
Right. Yeah, my team just knows when the door's shut and it was locked, I was just traveling, so call me. And then when when we were in the middle of a pandemic, the door was always shut, and so they just called me, and not a whole lot changed. 90% of my job was already on the phone, so it just turned into video meetings. That was the biggest
Yeah, it's
change for
funny.
me.
I've been in business 26 years. This is my 26th year. Um, I've had clients for I have one of my longest clients is since 1999. If I would have bumped into them on a street, standing in line somewhere with them, I would have not known who they were until the last year. I never met them physically, didn't know what they looked like other than a LinkedIn picture
Right.
or something. Had no idea. But over the last year, I got to meet a lot of my clients because it was easier because we did a video call and we got to see each other. So again, things have changed. Some things have gotten a lot better. Feel a lot closer to a lot of people. Again, sharing experiences, backgrounds. You look in the back and you see a painting, or you see your kids' drawings, or you see something from sports. It just created a lot more opportunity rather than a sterile environment.
Yeah, you get on those calls and you're like, if you don't see a cameo from a cat or a dog. One of my favorites was it would have been like May, June, right around that time where we were like, oh, geez, we might be home longer than we thought. At one point, I was on a call and everybody was growing some sort of facial hair. It was like
Yeah, we couldn't get right.
it
I
was,
had long hair.
yeah.
Everybody had, yeah, everybody had
Couldn't go to
long
get
hair.
your hair cut, so everybody was just seeing how long it could go.
I remember
Yeah,
being on a call really early on, and again, it just exposed the fact is that I'm not sure a lot of these opportunities would have existed before. But I remember I was at a call. There was a group, and they were doing these. It was the the not mental, global mentor network, um, and they have their mentor network was really top officials, and they had General Stanley McChrystal from the Afghanistan years,
wow.
and he was one of the speakers, and they were talking about how you adapt, and he was talking about logistics and planning and what it was like, to mobilize or demobilize or extract. Basically, he was talking about extracting forces. You were talking about taking people out of the workforce. And in the middle of his presentation, his young granddaughter comes in, and he just picks her up, puts her on her lap, and introduces her to everybody. Where prior to that, that would have been like right before that was where that episode happened on like YouTube, where a little young child ran into the executive's office,
Oh yeah.
went on the screen, and like
Yep.
the mother came in and quickly hushed him
Hold her.
away.
Hold
And
her.
I was like, oh, I'm so embarrassed that happened. He tried to
Yeah.
talk right through it like nothing was going on. Now is like a real human being. Yeah, that's what most people go through when they're working from home. And prior to that, it was a distraction. And over the year, it became all the valuable time we had to have now with our kids that you never used to see.
Right.
So I mean, now I don't have any young kids, but I have a grandchild. He's 19 months, and mostly my wife, I'll say at that point, babysits Tuesdays and Thursdays, but I try to carve out some time. But as soon as he comes over, he wants to come down to my office. So he'll come in, and oftentimes I'm on a call, and I just pick him up, introduce him to the group. He waves, and off he goes.
Yep.
That made us human beings.
Right. Right.
That made us real, which I hope we don't lose that.
We'll be back after a quick break.
And so used to having everything in front of them right away that we forget that innovation just takes time. I myself, I get frustrated too. Why? And this is being one of my best friends is, hey, I talk to you all the time. Hey, man, I'm frustrated in the fact that I can't seem to just get there in the next day. But that's just not how these things work, right? Innovation needs to be planned out. It needs to be very methodical. And then when it finally hits, that's when it seems like to everyone else that it sort of just came out of nowhere. But to you, the amount of dedication that it took over that time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because so much of the work in HR of the last few years has been about employee experience, human experience, humanizing the workplace, being more authentic, in the workplace. And yeah, 2020 was one of those years. It was, a lot of the technological changes that happened. It kind of forced that a little bit. And I think it certainly humanized a number of my colleagues, and it almost gave us, it's like we were kind of in the same foxhole, right? We've got this common enemy, this unseen enemy, and we're all in the same situation together, and just trying to survive. So when we're going through some of these formative experiences, and you talked about grit and getting stronger. I know there's a tendency for people to just kind of long for normal. And the phrase that I feel like it's so overused now is this concept of the new normal. So as we look at normal, is that anything that we're ever going to get back to?
I can't remember if it was in the beginning of this or before we went on the air. We were talking about diversity and inclusion. Let's talk about social and racial equity, justice. I'm not sure there's a whole segment of the population that does not want to go back to normal. You can go back to when I was young. I mean, normal in the 60s was that a woman needed her husband's permission to get birth control. Needed her husband's signature to get a loan. Normal was women didn't go to Ivy League schools. That was normal. Is that the normal you're talking about? Prior to civil rights, I mean, we're 50 years into civil rights. Is normal that blacks aren't able to drink out of the same fire hydrant, ride the same bus, stay in the same hotels? That was normal back then. So the question is what's normal is also unique to our perspective. People want to go back to what they knew, what they're comfortable with. Some people do. Other people do not. So I talk about the next, and I didn't really think about it that way until everybody, as you said, came up with new normal, next normal, future normal, a whole variety.
Right.
And one of my colleagues talked about there'll be multiple futures. And so I tend to talk about preparing for the next waves, plural, of normals. There will be, and normals becomes in multiple ways that you may experience normal differently than I do, but we're both white males. But then there's people in different parts of the country, different parts of the world, different colors, different races, different genders that will experience normal for good or bad. It will be different for them, but it's also going to come in waves. Not everybody's going to experience. It wasn't like July 4th, the world opens up and everybody's good. We know that's not going to happen. We know there's going to be other transformations. So how do we change our mindset? How do we individually adapt to next waves of normal? So I've been vaccinated. Pennsylvania's in pretty good shape. They talked about, I think Philadelphia is like going full blast open in 2 or 3 weeks. Other parts of the state are doing that. There's other states that are still shutting down. We're still wondering what we're going to do with schools. But it's not universal. I mean, there are different. And then on top of that, it's like, okay, the pandemic's gone, but now we got a gas shortage.
Yeah. The hackers on the pipeline and the gas shortage.
I talk about VUCA. That was my TED talk. I talk about VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I said, what a better acronym for 2020, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That's what it was. If you want to have one definition of normal, it will be volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's VUCA. That's the new normal, which means that it's completely uncertain. It's uneven. We're going to have waves of it. My definition of normal is VUCA. which is not most people's definition of normal. Most people's definition of normal is predictable, slow, steady. Um,
Right.
no,
Comfortable.
the answer to that is no.
Right. Right. Yeah.
We're not going back.
I'm really glad you didn't just answer it no, because that would have been a much less entertaining response. Yeah, I mean, yeah, gas, gas line hack. Like, what a great example of just something that it's probably predictable but unexpected. And now you got the government coming out and saying, "Hey guys, don't fill up plastic bags with gas. It's not a good idea." It's like, come on, guys, let's take a deep breath.
Yeah, and
Everything will be
don't take
okay.
all the toilet and don't get all the toilet paper and paper towels.
Right. I don't know about other HR people, but I kind of find HR to be kind of like a funny case study in human behavior, and like a little bit of psychology, a little bit of sociology mixed in, and sometimes it's just kind of fun to watch you know the reactions of people. But as we talk about kind of the VUCA world, and I agree 100%. I like to say change is the only constant. And I can't remember where I heard that. I didn't make that up,
Well,
but
but what which is also interesting, Hercules said that like in 400 BC. That's where that came from.
it's
So
trademarked.
they've been talking all along. Yeah,
Yeah,
copyright and trademark.
yeah,
But they've been talking along that since BC
yeah,
is
yeah,
change is the only constant. We still haven't, as human beings, we still don't believe it.
yeah. So how do we build that muscle? How do we build our adaptability, so that we're ready for that, so that we can be nimble in these types of situations?
I'm glad you asked. I've been, again, my TED talk was about VUCA. It was about, we talked about VUCA Prime, which I got to give credit to Bob Johansson from the Institute of Future. He turned me on to that. And he talked about, how do you turn volatility? There's a VUCA Prime, and VUCA Prime, his version of it, was a vision, um, understanding, clarity, and agility. So that was the focus. How do you turn that uncertainty into tools that you can use? And, there's a couple different variations. So when I did my TED talk, that's what we talked about. But making that, it's like, how do you make that transition? And so I was introduced to the adaptability quotient a few years ago, and then uh, ended up partnering with an organization in the UK. They did a lot of research through Singularity University, through the UN, through a couple corporations, and a few other universities. And they started to look at the question you just asked: how do we build that? And what they identified, there were 15 dimensions, and they broke them into three categories. We, individuals have abilities, they have skills. And then there was our character. How does our personality impact that? So as an extrovert, we need to talk to other people. We need to think out loud. And for introverts, you think to yourself, you mull it over. And how does that impact your ability to change? And then the third factor was the environment. And the environment is the company culture, which we also talked about earlier. So company culture wasn't necessarily that we had to be in one place and there was something that you felt, but it was measured by company support, team support, emotional support, how stressful is the job, and how stressful is the environment in which you work in. So you have the three categories, and they call it the ACE model, ACE, which is abilities, character, and environment. I've been focusing on the abilities, and we mentioned two of the five abilities before: grit and resilience. So we do need grit, and we need resilience, because moving through the stages of adaptability is, at the low end, there are people who collapse, who fail, who decline. Uh, And then you have coping. So there's skills you need to cope with change, but coping doesn't help you get better. And then you can grow. How do you grow with change? And then, or how do you thrive with change? Because you can grow but not thrive. So the four stages are declining, coping, growing, and thriving. How do you move through those? Well, you need grit and resilience. You need to persevere to go from one step to the other. You need resilience because there's going to be setbacks no matter what. We're going to have setbacks. But how do you become better? How do we go back to that anti-fragility that I talked about? How do you grow stronger and better? And in order to do that, you need have a growth mindset. If you're familiar with growth mindset, Carol Dweck, WDECK, if anybody wants to look that up, she wrote a book. She did studies with kids, which is the same what Angela Duckworth did with grit. They had identified that in kids first, and then how do we take that to business? A fixed mindset is, and I was afflicted with a fixed mindset for years. Fixed mindset was that our Q was set, our intelligence was set, and you're either smart or you're not, or you're good or you're not. And at some point, if you had good grades, if you were smart, if you were a star athlete, you stopped experimenting, you stopped trying things. Because if you failed, people would say, "Oh, I thought you were so good. I thought you were the star. I thought you were the top of the class. I hired you to do this job, and now you're saying you need to go back to school." Well, I got hired a student if they need to go back to school. Why do I need to do that? So you started to fall into that fixed mindset. And growth mindset was just that life is life. We're always evolving, we're always learning, we're always growing. We're gonna make mistakes. You learn from your mistakes. So we need a growth mindset. We need mental flexibility. Mental flexibility is the ability. There's a couple definitions for it, but primarily it's the ability to take two opposing thoughts and keep two opposing thoughts in your head at the same time. So it's literally listening to CNN and Fox News and MSNBC simultaneously and not taking sides, but trying to see what's the big picture. How does this all work? And not having your head blow up.
Yeah.
So it's mental flexibility is a struggle. And then the final one is unlearning. That's not the final one. The fifth one is unlearning. And then learning is not dumping, it's not doing a brain dump. It's not forgetting everything you did. But it's how do I unlearn the bad behaviors or the counterproductive behaviors? They worked. They helped me get to this place. That's what I was known for. But you know what? If I continue to do that over and over again, they're not going to work. It's not going to be helpful. They're not going to be as successful. So I need to learn new things, but I need to unlearn or maybe apply them in a different way and unlearn the old model. So the 5 abilities that we can, and the good thing about this, they're all learnable, is grit, resilience, mental flexibility, growth mindset, and unlearning. And by doing that, they've been able to demonstrate that people that can improve in those areas can become more adaptable. And ultimately, what adaptability does is adaptability gives you the courage to try new things, to take that step, to try a new behavior, to get a new job, to change the business model, whatever it might be. It gives you the courage to do that. And the more attempts you have at it, the more confident you become. And ultimately, if you become confident, you're more hopeful. And this is about hope. I mean, it's about you can't go into the future with a dystopian view that the robots are going to take our jobs and the world's coming to an end and we're all going to asphyxiate because of climate change and we're be underwater. I mean, if that's how are we going to, if we're always going to be on the defensive, you're not going to be optimistic. But how do you develop hope? How do you become more hopeful for our future? And in order to do that, you need to be confident, you need to be courageous. And so I don't look at it as adaptability as, oh, it's a number one leadership skill. It's an everybody's skill. And the group that I've partnered with has a mission. I mean, their mission is how do you help 100 million people in the next 10 years not be left behind? Because that's the risk of how many, the World Economic Forum estimated, this was before 2020, estimated that 375 million people are at risk of being left behind. And some of that was just lack of technology. Some of that was lack of clean water, clean air in other events. But it's much worse now. It just got accelerated. So again, how do we make that leap? How do we get people more comfortable, more courageous, more confident, more hopeful? is through adaptability. And the good thing is they're also uniquely human skills. We are so far off from having a robot or AI being more open-minded. Um, you know, they can learn patterns, but they can't unlearn the patterns that they come up with. That's not what AI does. Eventually, yeah, but we're pretty far off from that. So, what are the uniquely human skills we can teach people to develop and improve? And it's grit, resilience, mental flexibility, growth mindset, and unlearning.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. I think you summed it up so well. And as I reflect on my career and my growth in organizational, experiences that I've had, and if you're in human resources and you aren't adaptable, it's really going to be a struggle. It's not going to be fun, quite frankly. And I think especially in our world, it is easy to it's easy to lose hope sometimes because the problems are so challenging, and you have to have that kind of that grit and resilience, and you have to sometimes you're helping people through maybe some of the worst situations that they've ever dealt with in their lives,
Hmm.
um, whether that's termination of employment, or the illness of a family member or themselves. Those types of situations land on our desk all the time. But I loved your perspective that hope you know hope allows you to be adaptable, and I think
Right.
that certainly hit home for me. It's kind of like the I can't remember the movie, but it was a Woody Allen movie, and he was a young child, and he said, what's the point? Eventually the sun's gonna grow up, and Earth's gonna be over in a few billion years, so why are we here at all?
Yeah, you always had a unique perspective of looking at things.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because when we talk about from an HR perspective, we talk about I get a call every day. I mean, my business is we primarily do like pre-employment and leadership testing. So I get a call is we want to test for grit, we want to test for emotional intelligence, or then I'm involved with a lot of other conversations on diversity and inclusion and bias and pay equity. How do we make those changes? Well, that all requires a bit of adaptability. But all the people that are involved, how do you get people to become more accepting of other people? How do you get people to become more empathetic? How do you do that? How do you become more empathetic? How do you develop emotional intelligence, which is the ability to see, to feel somebody else's emotions, to be able to read the crowd? How do you do that if you don't have a growth mindset, if you don't have mental flexibility and unlearning? So we can't, all the tasks, all the projects that are on is, well, this year we're going to focus leadership on emotional intelligence, and strategically we're going to look at diversity and inclusion, and then maybe we can talk about adaptability. You know,
Right.
I don't know how you do any of those things unless you teach people to become more understanding of other people, to be able to walk in other people's shoes, to be able to read the crowd, to see a different perspective, to unlearn. I can't tell you how many things I unlearned last year. And part of it was because somebody introduced to me. The important part of it is through the podcast. You interview some interesting guests, and it's like, oh, I never saw that before. It,
Right.
you know how and how difficult it is, especially about racial inequalities.
Yeah.
I mean, there was so much that came out last year, and it's like, how did I not see that? I thought I was doing the right thing, and I wasn't. And again, it's not feel it. You feel guilty to a degree, but how do I not continue to repeat that?
Right.
And you have to be comfortable with that. You can't become comfortable with it if you're not adaptable.
Right. Right. Well, this has just been an absolutely wonderful conversation, and I want to be mindful of time. So I really appreciate the content today. We're going to shift gears, and we're going to go into the Rebel Human Resources Flash Round. All right, here we go. Question number 1. What are you reading right now?
Oh gosh, I got 15 books piled up on my desk. Yeah, two books. One is Humanocracy, and this is probably going into your second question as well, because I'm listening to it on Audible and reading it on Kindle simultaneously. And the other is the adaptation advantage. And obviously for good reasons, we just talked a lot about it. Some really, really good perspectives, on that. Humanocracies by Gary Hamel and Michele Zanini. It's really excellent. It shoots down bureaucracy, the bureaucracy, and HR is a bureaucracy.
Yeah. I hate bureaucracy. That's part of why, we started this podcast, to try to, kind of knock down the pillars of HR as the cop, or the people catch you doing the wrong things,
Right.
or drawing up a 600-page policy book that no one reads.
No, exactly. So humanocracy, some great concepts in there, and really enjoying that. And adaptation advantage sort of fits in the same realm.
Got it. All right, perfect. Question number 2: who should we be listening to?
Obviously, Kyle Rode, Rebel HR.
Enter shameless plug. All right, thanks, Ira. Appreciate it.
Geek Skeezers Googlization.
There you go.
Is out there. Really, there are so many quality people. Josh Burson, is certainly way out there. He's one of the leaders. But I'll give you some advice and I don't necessarily have one specific person, but I heard this by Jeff Hoffman. Jeff Hoffman was one of the co-founders of Priceline, and he talked. I'm drawing a blank. I just had brain freeze of what what he called it, but it was essentially every day he, for 10 or 15 minutes, would read something or listen to something that had nothing to do with his business. And people go, well, why he wasn't in the restaurant business. Why were you doing restaurants? If you were in banking, why would you read about restaurants? Well, the drive-through didn't come from banking. The drive-through came from McDonald's, fast food restaurant.
Sure.
So why couldn't we do that? Why couldn't you drive up and drop your deposit off? Why do you have to come into the bank? So there's things happening in other industries that will impact, or you can learn from, in your business. So my suggestion is if it was who do I listen to, pick somebody in some other industry that you say, I don't know anything about this, and see what's happening in that business, and that'll be the lesson.
I love that response. Learn or unlearn something by listening to someone different, right?
Yeah,
love
sure.
it. All right, last question here, hard-hitting question for you. How can our listeners connect with you?
Oh, many different ways. I'm on social. Well, on my website, successperformancesolutions.com. That's the business, or simply irawolfe.com. That's my personal site. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. You can Google my name. But if you connect with me, reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter, I'll respond accordingly and connect back with you. You can also just Google. Speaking of Googlization, put my name in. Ira S Wolfe. S is for Stephen, and I will show up somewhere.
Absolutely. And newest book that's out and available now?
It's Recruiting in the Age of Googlization. It's on Amazon. You can go up to the website. It's available through my website as well. If you want a side copy, go to the website. If you want it quick, go to Google or go to Amazon.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ira. It's just been absolutely wonderful talking to you today, and I thought some really valuable content for anybody, whether you're in HR or not. I think anybody who's looking to understand the new normal and how that may need to shift in your mind, and some ways to get there. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Ira.
Thanks very much. Don't, as I always close, don't let the shift hit your plans.
Thanks. All right, that does it for the Rebel HR podcast. Big thank you to our guests. Follow us on Facebook at Rebel HR Podcast, Twitter at Rebel HR Guy, or see our website at rebelhumanresources.com. The views and opinions expressed by Rebel HR Podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the any of the organizations that we work with. No animals were harmed during the filming of this podcast.
Baby.